Chapter 68.
You don't have to do this.
Lorelei repeated it for perhaps the 15th time, having wheeled around the little patch of turf so many times that tracks had been ground into the soil. And they would have stayed there, if the ground weren't slowly rising up around them, but Ruslana had little time to waste worrying. The world could end when it liked, but until it had.
I absolutely do. Isn't hard to see, really. If your magic can't take you down there, and Zhao, and Bones, and Zambi are in trouble, falls on me to do what I have to do.
Ruslana smiled fearlessly, giving the tether another hesitant pull. It held up well, and felt like it wouldn't crack entirely, so.
Trust me, I've no intention of dying here. And I'm not going to let anyone else die, either. Not now, not when we're so close.
Closing her eyes, Ruslana took a deep breath. The air was thin here, and tasted of ozone, but Dragunov was nowhere to be seen. Maybe the air simply was growing weaker as the world collapsed around them. Maybe, a ghoulish thought entered her mind, they'd all die from altitude sickness before the world had. Or was it oxygen toxicity? Her mother would have known. But not right now. Not here.
Anyway, we've been with this before. Since Grendolf has disappeared, you'll be responsible for taking care of the rest of us. Just carry on as you are, and I know you'll do fine.
Of course, that wasn't what Lorelei was worrying about. The young witch had been blinking around a little bit, though Ruslana wasn't entirely sure what that meant. She didn't seem to be in any danger or pain, but little strands of electric blue light occasionally blurred into existence wherever she rolled, or shot forward like sparks from her nervous hand gestures.
You know that's not it. Ugh.
Lorelei began, then almost as immediately gave up. She pulled her hat far enough down that it looked like it might engulf her face. It was kind of cute and didn't really suit the moment, Ruslana thought amusedly. She wasn't sure why she felt so calm, and yet.
Can't you listen? Not every moment needs to be a self-sacrifice, and you don't need to do things alone.
The witch held an anger to her mumbling that was less demure. It was bitter and tired, and spoke of the attrition they'd all been suffering. But Ruslana knew that this one time, there really wasn't anyone else who could, or should, be assisting. Caverns cut out the harpy, and Binky was more likely to be liability when agility came to the fore. Mr. Mammon was not a combatant. Paul? Absolutely not. The Boulder folk had been shining non-stop for some time, now, and chittering in a deeply unpleasant way.
Lorelei.
Ruslana closed her eyes again. Home. She had ideas of what home had been, and what she wanted it to be. Ruslana could see the endless blue skies, not quite the skies of the island here, but cloudless, gentle days that lasted even into fall. When the apples fell from high trees, and duty came to an end. A time, perhaps, of heroism, but when there was no need for soldiers, anymore.
We've had a damn good run of things. To have met such wonderful people, and to fought battles like this, I cannot find a single regret.
Her smile betrayed her words.
It has been an honor to.
The words felt stiff in Ruslana's throat even as she talked. She could still remember the day she had came her, rifle at her side, feeling confident and alive and prepared. She could do this, she. Her eyes opened to see Lorelei facing her, tears coming unashamedly from the corners of her eyes. Anger and sorrow held each onto each other with bitter disregard as she grit her teeth and stared at Ruslana so intensely that finally, Ruslana simply looked away.
And that's it, then? Ciao, and now you. You'll just go, too? Harumph. I apologize for interrupting.
Both Lorelei and Ruslana shifted where they stood. Mildred hovered slowly to the ground, eyeing up the oddly risen dirt with amusement.
So it seems you've managed to anger dear Lorelei. I should have half a mind to deal with you myself, but such as it is, I think accompanying you should be a suitable punishment.
Ruslana began, but the tiny witch cut her off with a venomous scowl.
Not a word out of you. I am convinced of the matter, and that is final. Lorelei. A moment.
Ruslana politely bobbed her head and turned away, chastened. Her shorn hair felt incredibly unconcealing at the moment. And the way Mildred occasionally cackled didn't help things. What terrible, if not inspiring timing the witch held.
Sorry about that. Mildred said that things always look darkest before the world falls to pieces. I'm not angry with you. It's just...
Gulping back air, Ruslana shook her head firmly.
Please, don't say anything. I understand. I need to feel brave right now. Yawning chasms in the earth.
Kalimir had talked about those, once. Hadn't she? Over a campfire one evening, while waiting for meat to roast and fog to settle in overhead.
Dealing with them is easy. I wanted to say goodbye quickly, so that I could come back as quickly, you know.
She laughed a little, feeling a sickness in her stomach.
You will come back. Or I'll find a way to come for you, even if I have to carry all four of you out myself. Mildred'll be fine, the fourth one is Leo.
Even though she was laughing, Ruslana couldn't help but frown a little.
Still certain this isn't his fault somehow? It'd be like a man whose failure has cost so much to give things one final roll of the die. It wouldn't be impossible for you, though.
Ruslana forced herself to look from Lorelei's face, where tears had dried away and laughter pulled at the edge of her cheeks, to the sunken, cavernous pit below. It didn't seem frightening, right now, but whatever was down there. Lorelei would be all right.
I'll come after you if you don't come back in one piece. So, come back. Well, having already lost an eye, I'll try not to lose much more. Mildred, are you ready?
Knowing that she wouldn't be able to force herself forward if she waited much longer, Ruslana picked herself up off of the ground, unnerved at how rapidly tiny, hill-like boils had formed at the surface of the soil. Mildred had been watching them silently. She seemed displeased, or perhaps sad, or perhaps she was cautious with her affections, as was the way of witches.
I have been ready since the two of you spoke. Lorelei, know that I'll safeguard this one, for you. We will not be dallying for too long, do not lose track of time.
Then, Mildred latched onto her back with surprising speed and force. Ruslana could feel the old witch's eyes burrowing into her skull, glowering all the while.
Is this really necessary? Can't you, float down there or... Absolutely necessary. I won't waste magic on a long climb.
Mildred laughed nastily, and Ruslana shrugged.
Just be careful you don't knock my rifle free, and hold on tightly. Well, then.
She approached the very edge of the chasm, hearing the squeaky turning of Lorelei's wheelchair, but not quite daring to stare at the side and see her friend, standing there. The darkness stared back up at her, and Ruslana felt her fingers drawn to her eye patch. It was so incredibly dark, and the only objects visible were pillars of solid stone. With one last, deep breath, Ruslana gave the long coil of rope, assembled from many ropes, sheets, and clothes they had cannibalized from District, one final tug and, satisfied with its lyrical twang, lowered herself and Mildred into the pit. Soon, there was nothing but darkness around them in every direction.
Know you well what you're doing. I did not come with you to aid you.
It was perhaps a half hour down the pit that Mildred spoke. Her tone had changed completely, the energy and contempt all but gone from her voice and replaced with an incredible sadness that bore down upon her far more than the tiny form of the witch, herself.
So I imagined.
Ruslana began, hoping that she wouldn't find herself dead at the hands of her friend's mentor, but Mildred mumbled something, perhaps to herself, and then continued.
No, you would do fine on your own. I have no fear for you. But the powers that are at work here, beyond you, and beyond I. We must remain cautious. And we must attempt to hold on to hope. I have exhausted all else.
Ruslana could see some manner of floor far below, dark slate, perhaps. It was smooth and oddly grained, as if there had once been a great dust or soot upon it that had been cleared away, leaving only the worm-like contrails of twisting lines and shapes.
That bad, is it? I take it you'll tell me what's on your mind.
It wasn't particularly funny, but Ruslana found herself laughing, all the same. Collapsing in fear wasn't going to change anything, and perhaps...
No.
Mildred answered bluntly, a small trace of the earlier smugness returning to her voice.
Very well, as you like. Does your undoubtedly strong magic have a good grasp of where my friends are?
Mildred hemmed and hawed and stuck a finger into the air, her eyes shining in the darkness. No light conjured itself to guide them, but Ruslana found herself seeing better. Perhaps Mildred's presence alone was enough to cause the darkness to flee, for whatever reason that might be.
I'm storing quite a powerful spell, so don't interrupt me too much. But I do indeed have a clue where those children might be found. It feels like we aren't too far away from them, and yet...
Tiny wisps of light wound around her finger, forming a pale and iridescent string around the witch's finger. She gave it a sharp yank, and the strands fell to the ground, exploding into tiny green shots of light.
Ah, very good. You may go in front, and I'll follow at a comfortable distance. Should you fall, I shall be glad to alert my pupil to your demise.
Where, precisely, had the earlier concern the witch held gone? They walked, or rather, Ruslana walked and Mildred floated a safe distance behind her, for some time. Ruslana kept account of it in her head, but time and distance seemed less like concepts and more like guidelines in the deep dark, under the earth. Salt had been scattered everywhere, too, and it grew heavier the farther they found themselves. Eventually, Ruslana found herself knee-deep in the stuff, though not long after it became thick enough to walk on top of, vast dunes of it, perhaps enough to bury someone alive.
This isn't natural, is it?
Ruslana whispered, looking up for some stalactites, though of course, with no clearly visible roof, none could be seen.
Good. You are not quite as airheaded as you might look. No, of course not, the world cannot remember what it was meant to look like. The underbus is far from here and largely safe from such machinations, but...
Mildred hovered over to a large plume of salt that looked almost as if it had been someone fleeing from some unseen enemy. She glowered at it, and the salt drifted away, perhaps not wishing to antagonize her.
Any time a thing falls to its final moments, it dreams of what it might have been. People and places are not so different, but places have a power all their own. It is a duty of the wise magician to not neglect such things, and to gently remind, when memory fades.
Ruslana cupped one hand into the salt. It felt warm, as if it had been under a vent of hot air that had recently cooled. Perhaps it had, it was hard to tell, with the weather, as it was.
Thought, memory. Scout ahead.
She was aware of the slight blush on her cheeks while Mildred cackled at her uproariously.
Isn't funny. Oh, but isn't it? I wonder, Lorelei must find you awfully droll. Though I cannot fault the names as such.
Staring up into the ceiling that was not there, where the darkness stared inflexibly back at her, Ruslana kept walking through salt, aware with every step crunching beneath her that it had hardened here, as if exposed to a high heat and flame.
Perhaps it is a bit foolish of me, but I think they're kind of heroic. T was a story, or something like that, where I got the idea. You're not going to fault me for liking stories now, are you? Yes. I fault everyone, for everything.
She couldn't help it, Ruslana laughed, and Mildred was already cackling. The old witch was rather charming, in her own way, and aware of it, too. Hopefully it wouldn't all rub off on Lorelei, but...
All the same, you should keep such eyes and ears close at hand. There's no telling what we might encounter, in the dark. Oh, but I think you'll find there is.
Ruslana and Mildred alike jumped, the latter floating through the air before whirling around and curving an ancient, pale green finger towards the speaker. Her hateful snarl had barely left her lips before the underground salt lit into equally pallid teal light. Fragments of bone and pieces of ivory-white enamel showered the dark canopy, dyeing it wine-red with spattering blood that seemed to pour forth from the slumped form as if it had been attached to a great fountain of the stuff. Mildred frowned and cursed under breath even as she and Ruslana were drenched with viscera, or rather Ruslana was, for none of it seemed to touch Mildred, or if it did, the witch was soon free of it through some invisible force. Wiping her face off with her hand, Ruslana tried to overcome her shock, but could only manage to nod her head at Mildred, who smiled an unpleasant smile from ear to ear, and nodded back.
Ow, ow, ow. That really hurt. Why, I'd almost think we're enemies with that kind of mistreatment.
The smile disappeared, replaced by some indescribable and long-suffering pathos that Ruslana couldn't place. It reminded her a little of the old strategists who spent their entire lives spending elaborate battle plans, only to hear that they had been obsoleted in but an instance of new technology and changing situations. From behind her, some guy had stepped forth from the shadows. Arm. Snapping her fingers, Ruslana gave a curt nod.
You. I know you.
Looking flattered, and a little smug, the fellow with the very arctic silver hair waited for her response. Ruslana squinted into the darkness, trying to wonder if she needed to buy time for Mildred to do whatever she had just done. Again. But also because...
Sorry. Afraid I'm terrible with names, and though I feel certain I've met you, cannot say I recall you.
He face-vaulted into salt, wallowing around in the stuff while Mildred chuckled heartily.
Very good. And as far as I'm concerned, usurper, we are enemies. Just with common interests, but then again, you know my feelings on all matters. What brings you here? Ruined a fine spell, harumph.
Cursing under her breath, Mildred pulled her hat over her matted hair. Aha, perhaps that's where Lorelei had learned the gesture? Usurper shrugged his thin shoulders. For a man dressed in uniform of some kind, he seemed to be in good cheer and completely at home in the dark around them. Or at least unimpressed by it.
Well, I did come to warn you, but I didn't expect such fine company to be present. I'm afraid this doesn't concern you, Lance Sergeant. Do you mind giving me and Ms. Mildred some privacy?
Ruslana froze, carefully weighing her options.
Not at all. Go about your business. I'll count salt, until you return.
She shot Mildred a look from the side of her eye. Mildred seemed entirely unworried, which was certainly a good sign. But nevertheless... How long had it been since she had heard her rank called out? Perhaps... Could it be that Paul was right? This man, whom she knew she had never met before, or if she had, his presence was just generally forgettable, if not well-natured. Perhaps there truly was a moon base. Perhaps it was a matter that needed to be dealt with, in time, but that could come later. Ruslana knew it must be crazy, but seeing herself half reflected in hundreds of tiny crystalline grains of salt did not serve to dampen disquiet. She heard a sizzle of light that she had come to mentally associate with magic, and turned to her left. Mildred was looking quite pleased with herself as she hovered over, half-smile perched precariously on her face.
Good news, I take it.
Mildred chuckled throatily.
Oh, who can say? Not I. But I'm afraid I must leave, too. You'll be fine down here, I'm certain.
And then Mildred was gone before Ruslana had found a half-second to register her disbelief or complaints. She felt her shoulders quivering with rage, before a sharp-nailed tap on the small of her back caught her attention.
Don't worry. I'll trouble you to carry me back up that rope when we're leaving.
Mildred had somehow appeared behind her, laughing uproariously before fading into the darkness. Unable to maintain her anger, Ruslana gave a long sigh, and peered into the darkness, now seemingly empty of all but her and Salt. And her drones, of course. Which Mildred wasn't around to make fun of, at least.
Report.
She murmured, and the mechanical creations whispered secrets to her, and cameras and microphones were as true friends as any, though they could not think nor feel. Ruslana perceived that the place was huge, and shifted on a raised dais the size of the yards, several times over. There was a city, too, and she knew that if anything, Zhao would have pushed himself to find people, friends, or a safe place. It was the kind of young man he was. Ruslana's fist tightened, and she took a deep breath. Right.
Hang on.
She whispered into the darkness, and it did not reply. Tiny, crystalline grains of salt flung themselves from her path as Ruslana strode through the desolation beneath the earth, great pillars of unfamiliar stone rising from the ground as she ran. Chapter end.